When we look at the newspapers and find information about the war in Ukraine, it looks anything but rosy for Ukraine at the moment. Is that also your assessment?
Well, I don't know if the description is entirely accurate. I would say, of course, that Russia is currently taking the initiative, especially on the ground, in land operations and definitely also in air operations. But I think if you look at the overall picture, it is a more differentiated picture.
We can take a step-by-step look at the situation on the situation map. If you could show our viewers what the current situation is.
We can do that if we take a look at the northeast in the Kupichansk-Kreminny area. The Russians have certainly managed to push back Ukraine's defenses there in recent weeks. The very obvious intention of the Russian forces is to push back the Ukrainian defenders as far as the East-Kilt River, which we can see here on the map. We have all been following the battles for Avdiivka and the Rhine Creek Mut. Avdiivka fell around the middle of February. The Russian forces were able to take Avdiivka. We have a relative stalemate in the south, in the area of Zaporizhia Oblast. And if we look to the southwest, on the left bank of the Dnieper in the Kherson area, the Ukrainians are still able to hold their positions on the left bank of the Dnieper. For me, it's still too small to speak of a military bridgehead from which one could then attack further, but they are holding their ground despite the massive use of Russian artillery, not only in this area. Russian artillery is also a good keyword when we look at the causes. What is the cause of this land grab by the Russian armed forces? One of the main reasons is certainly Russian artillery superiority. The Russians are capable of firing up to 20,000 rounds per day. We assume that this results in an artillery superiority of 1 to 5 to 1 to 6. But you also have to put this land grab into perspective. We have calculated that since the beginning of the year, the Russian forces have managed to take about 300 square kilometers of space. That's roughly the size of Leipzig. As you can see, it's a more differentiated picture when you look at the land operations.
In other words, overall quite marginal land gains at the cost of considerable losses and material expenditure.
And material costs, that's certainly a good way to summarize it. What is also true, and then perhaps we change the dimension and go into the air sector, is that the Russian armed forces have not only greatly intensified their efforts in the area of drones and are constantly attacking Ukrainian positions with various types of drones, right down to individual vehicles, individual battery positions. But that since the beginning of March, at the latest, the missile attacks have also continued not only on military positions, military facilities, military industrial complexes, but also specifically in the population centers of the Russian armed forces. And if we go back to the front line, the Russian Air Force has started to make greater use of so-called glide bombs, against which heavy anti-aircraft air defense means can be found. And this has also contributed to the Russian armed forces being able to achieve the territorial gains we have just been talking about.
So the Ukrainians are holding up relatively well. Can they also achieve successes?
From the Ukrainian point of view, the Russian territorial gains are minor. They are also partial. It is a deliberate surrender of terrain, simply to protect their own material, to protect their own troops, but also to move to more favorable positions where they can fight the enemy more intensively and successfully. So it is a deliberate surrender of space in order to achieve this. If we look at the Ukrainians' air defense, it is still successful about 75%. The air warfare means of the Russian armed forces can be successfully countered. Conversely, the Ukrainians are increasingly able to penetrate far into the Russian heartland, especially with drones. In February and March in particular, we remember the far-reaching attacks against industry, against the gas and oil industry, which also caused considerable damage to Russian industry. So that was also a success of the Ukrainian Air Force, and if we change the dimensions again and look at the sea, then the Black Sea has almost become something like a Ukrainian Sea again. Because with many Ukrainian successes, the Russian Black Sea Fleet had to retreat behind Sevastopol. There is now a greater degree of freedom of movement for the Ukrainians there, and that is definitely a military success for Ukraine, which shows that the overall picture of the military situation at the moment is definitely one of many shades of gray.